Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today, I want to do a deep dive here on China because the trade war that we have going on with China, and if you didn't know, the United States has actively been in a trade war for a while, it's already starting to ramp up. Now, before I dive into what is going on, basically in the past, present, and what is going to be our potential future here with China in terms of trade, I want to say that I am agnostic to politics. Cybersecurity is also agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. And I don't care who you believe or who you voted for or blah, blah, blah. You could love or hate Biden, you could love or hate Trump, etc., etc. It doesn't matter to me. These are the facts on the ground, and I think it's important that we're all aware of what's happening. And if you recall, this trade war, as I mentioned, which has been going on, it's been going on since January of 2018, when then President Donald Trump began setting tariffs and other trade barriers on China with the goal of forcing it to make changes to what the United States was basically saying was a long-standing unfair trade practice and essentially intellectual property theft. There's actually a lot of logic in that statement because one of the big problems that we have with China, I can't really speak to the unfair trade practices, I'll leave that to the experts, but intellectual property theft coming from China is a huge problem that we've seen. And a lot of companies here in the United States, including Apple, Tesla, a major railroad company, design company, et cetera, have all seen their intellectual property stolen and moved to China, not to mention, basically other players around the world as well. And so we do have a problem with that. The real question is, how do we actually handle that? And so with that, let's talk about essentially what has been going on in terms of the history and the TikTok here, essentially, of this trade war. Now, the first Trump administration stated that those practices may contribute to the U.S.-China trade deficit and that the Chinese government requires transfer of American technology to China. In other words, they're basically ripping us off to improve their own products and therefore compete more globally on the innovations that we here in the United States have created, or rather individuals or U.S. corporations have. Now, in response to those U.S. trade measures, the Chinese government then accused the Trump administration, again, the first Trump administration, of engaging in nationalist protectionism and took retaliatory action. In other words, they're saying, well, you're basically becoming an isolationist, and by virtue of that, you're protectionist, you're not playing fair in like the WTO, et cetera, and so by virtue of that, they're going to retaliate. This is literally what happened here, for the record. I'm not making this up. You can go read about this yourself. Now, after that trade war was escalated through 2019, in January of 2020, both sides, the U.S. and China, reached basically a phase one agreement. It was kind of tense. By the end of Trump's first term and basically his presidency, as Biden came in the second one, again, I'm not adjudicating any of this. This is what happened. Essentially, by the end of Trump's first term or first presidency, the trade war was widely characterized as a failure for the United States. In other words, China basically really wasn't restricted in the same way that when we did a lot of this basically against Russia, and I'll talk about that in a second, it really didn't work. Now, the Biden administration, when basically President Biden was sworn in, kept those tariffs in place. It's very hard, for the record, to remove tariffs as well once they're entrenched into the economy. And the Biden administration also added additional levies on Chinese goods, such as electric vehicles and solar panels. To buy a Chinese car, or rather to import a Chinese car here in the United States, is something like 100% tariff, meaning if you're an American corporation that wants to buy a whole bunch of Chinese cars to introduce them into the market, by virtue of that, you're paying double what the manufacturer essentially would be charging you, which means that cost would be passed on to the user. So that $50,000 car becomes a $100,000 car. Now, that was seen essentially as a protection on Chinese manufacturing against the big three here, Ford, General Motors, and now Stellantis. And so by virtue of that, that's essentially why that was. Solar panel production as well is something we've gotten into that game. Now, in 2024, this year, basically when Trump was a candidate, this is before the election, he had proposed a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. And we'll get to that as well, because the new Trump administration is really seeming to ramp up like this, because they are talking about this. Specifically, President-elect himself basically have talked about blanket tariffs for pretty much all trading partners of the United States, which would be seen globally as nationalism and protectionism. And again, I'm not adjudicating that. I'm not an expert in tariffs, but he's talking about that as tariffs for China, tariffs for our neighbors to the north, Canada, and our neighbors to the south, Mexico as well. We do a ton of business with both Canada and Mexico, and so leveling tariffs on them are difficult. Mexico is also responding, but we're going to stick with China as well. The EU is also basically under President-elect Trump's radar as well, as we would basically put tariffs on EU goods coming from those countries as well. So we're expecting, for the record, those tariffs to start in 2025 when he is sworn in. He's sworn in on January 20th of next year. However, we have new shots across the bow, though, in this war, and it just started with the outgoing Biden administration. And it's not tariffs, for the record, what they're doing, but this is an interesting one, and quite frankly, China's already responded. So what happened here is the United States Department of Commerce introduced a sweeping package of export controls on Monday, December 2nd of this year, and those are designed to weaken China's domestic semiconductor ecosystem and also undermine China's ability to manufacture advanced chips locally. Now, what they've been doing, or China has rather, is they've been running what looks like knockoff Intel clones and some other processors, but they're not quite where Intel is, or NVIDIA, or any of these other companies, because quite frankly, Intel, NVIDIA, et cetera, have had decades of advancement that China is now trying to catch up to. Now, these new regulations prevent China from accessing 24 different types of chip manufacturing equipment and 3 software programs. They also place restrictions on the sale to China of high bandwidth memory, or HBM. That's an advanced kind of 3D stacked computer memory component that is often used in customized chips for artificial intelligence. Now, if you recall, we, the United States, also leveled something similar, but more stringent than that, on Russia shortly after their invasion of Ukraine. In other words, Russia could only purchase chips that were the equivalent of like 1995 or 1998 processors at the time to severely restrict them. That also, as I mentioned earlier, like the restrictions on China, didn't really work, and the Russians were buying them through cutouts all over the place to continue essentially doing what they were doing. So, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said on a call with reporters regarding this, and I quote, "They're the strongest controls ever enacted by the U.S. to degrade the PRC, People's Republic of China's, ability to make the most advanced chips that they are using in their military modernization," end quote. And yes, that is true. China has been on a tear to improve and harden their military, their navy, et cetera, et cetera. Now, over the past decade, the United States has grown increasingly concerned that China could use cutting-edge computer technology to build AI-powered military weapons or other technology that threatens the United States and the United States' current allies. Now, I say that to say that this has been an issue. I've done videos and podcasts on this where basically, if we have autonomous weaponry that is allowed to think for itself, this is what is being developed. And if you have a country that has, let's say, less scruples on, human rights and human life, then they are more prone to have, let's say, autonomous weapons that will kill indiscriminately, as opposed to ones that would have to stop and think, or would have human intervention, meaning we actually have to press the button before the drone can shoot at what it thinks is a tank, but is actually a school bus. And now we have humans basically eyeballing that, saying, no, we probably shouldn't shoot at the school bus. Let's wait for the tank. So, to address this issue, the Biden administration has concentrated its efforts on preventing China from acquiring high-end semiconductors made by companies like NVIDIA and also TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Now, TSMC obviously is a very close ally of ours, sitting on the island of China. Basically, the two China policy, one China policy, all that kind of stuff, again, open for debate, but we are going to stick with this ongoing trade war that we have here, because within 24 hours of basically the Department of Commerce coming out with this, China has responded. Now, on Tuesday, basically December 3rd, literally 24 hours or within 24 hours, China's Ministry of Commerce basically hit back, announcing a ban that takes effect immediately on, quote, exports of dual-use items related to gallium, germanium, antimony, and super hard materials to the U.S., end quote. In other words, rare earth elements that we need for technology. So such dual-use items cover goods and technologies for both civilian and military purposes, and the rare earth metals are critical to manufacturing technology. So this is a huge issue. This retaliation, for the record, was not unexpected. Experts previously talking to Ars Technica, where I'm getting some of this information, Information, as well as Wired and a couple of other publications, said that the United States risked losing access to rare earth metals critical to manufacturing a wide range of popular products if it placed any new trade restrictions on China. But here's the interesting thing as well, because experts are also speculating in the last 24 hours that it's possible that this ban on exports to the United States could also be a response to President-elect Donald Trump's threat to increase tariffs on all Chinese goods once he takes office. Now, China's response to Biden's last round of tariffs, which is why they're speculating here, was relatively muted. And this is a really large escalation. So analysts are warning that this new export curb could basically end up hurting businesses in the United States and allied nations, while potentially doing very little to block China from accessing U.S. tech. As I mentioned earlier, both Russia and China have been very good about getting around those bans using cutouts or export controls, getting around export controls. And so by virtue of this, this may not have the stinging effect that the Biden administration would want. And I would have to imagine, if we're talking about an even political playing field, the Trump administration would be a fan of this as well if they're looking at doing blanket tariffs on China. So on Tuesday, 4 Chinese industry associations basically added fuel to the fire here by threatening U.S. businesses, essentially by warning Chinese firms that purchasing U.S. chips is no longer safe, according to Asia Financial. So if you're a Chinese firm and you're trying to purchase U.S. chips, basically there could be consequences essentially from the Chinese government. Remember, the Chinese government has its hands in all private corporation. That is the structure of their government. I've talked about that 2017 law regarding data privacy, but it goes way beyond that when we're talking about things like this. Now, apparently, these groups would not say how or why these chips were unsafe, but the warning could hurt U.S. chip-making giants like Intel, AMD, NVIDIA, and also the financial industry publication closely monitoring China was forecasting that this would indeed impact those companies. Now, as U.S. and China tensions are escalating ahead of Trump's next term, which starts on January 20th of next year, the tech industry has warned that unpredictable rises in costs may end up spiking prices on popular consumer technology. And so with Trump publicly stating, like right now, President-elect Trump, that he wants to add a 35% tariff to Chinese goods, all Chinese goods, they don't care if it's a finger puppet or a rocket, that basically means that average Americans could end up being harmed by the trade war, as we could potentially be paying significantly more for laptops, smartphones, game consoles, and on and on. Remember that basically the iPhones and a lot of the other technology that we have is manufactured in China. Apple may be sitting here in Cupertino, in the United States, but remember, they use Foxconn for manufacturing, which is a Chinese-based company. And while Foxconn has plants all over the world, South America, other parts of Asia, a lot of the manufacturing happens in China, which means as that iPhone essentially is coming back, and we're going to be charged $1,000 for it at basically a 35% tariff, now we're looking at $1,350. Because remember, to purchase that stuff, that tariff basically impacts U.S. companies purchasing this, which means they're going to turn that cost around to the consumer. And so I think this is an interesting one to watch. I do not have an answer for this per se, but I think that this is an important thing to understand, that as we are in a global economy and we have trading relationships with various partners, to make sure that we are indeed honoring those partners and those relationships as they should be honoring ours. Now, trade imbalances do happen, and sometimes that's natural, meaning, and I'll use a basic example. Let's say, as an example, Canada is much better at manufacturing cars in plants as we are, but we're much better at manufacturing airplanes. Okay, whatever it is. And so by virtue of that, it makes more sense for us to have a trading relationship with Canada, because they're going to make cars less expensive and more cost efficient to manufacture. Therefore, it's going to be cost effective for us to purchase, as it would be for them to purchase airplanes from us. And so by virtue of that, those can be unbalances. It's not necessarily unfair to either Canada or the United States as an example, but nevertheless, you have deficits that could be intentional deficits being created by countries like China if they're stealing intellectual property to gain competitive advantage. And so I think that this is something that we're going to have to look out for. But the point of this is to understand what is coming, what we will potentially see here as consumers in the United States, meaning much higher costs by virtue of essentially this escalation between the United States and China through the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, now the second Trump administration really turning on the gas. I think this is something that we have to watch out for. And so by virtue of that, plan ahead, plan accordingly. As for how to basically fix the China situation, in other words, having them stop, rip off our intellectual property, short of cutting off the internet from China, I really don't see, how we can do that. Not to mention the fact you can manually, remove or steal intellectual property as well if you're hiring somebody that's working on behalf of the Chinese government, as what happened to Tesla and Apple. So we'll see essentially what happens here, but it's going to be, I think, a difficult time all the way around, and I'm hoping that we're able to stabilize this, get this under control, and quite frankly, continue to have basically the benefit of low-cost goods by virtue of the level of consumption that we have here in the United States. Time will tell. I guess we're in this together, so good luck to us all. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private while keeping our costs low. I don't care what the administration is, just keep our costs low. Take care.